Module 8, you should be able to differentiate between the IEP procedural requirements and the IEP substantive requirements, okay? You should also be able to determine and describe the purposes of the IEP and then the required components of the IEP. I know that module was pretty sort of intense in terms of walking through all of those required components, but many of you have had experiences either as parents or as teachers or as social workers or behavior specialists. And so I think if you can apply your experiences and your own knowledge to those as you think through IEPs and the implications of IEP, particularly for children with behavioral problems, that will really help you to kind of grasp some of those concepts. So if you still have any remaining questions about IEP writing or goals, please do feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to talk more with you about that. So just as a review of those required components, remember you have your PLAAFP, or the present level of academic achievement and functional performance, the annual goals and short-term objectives, which should be measurable and specific. You have your services and modifications that are needed, the statement of extent of participation in general education settings, of course, the behavior intervention plan, which is critical for this particular class. You also need to include the dates, the frequency, and the duration of services and modifications. So you want to be really clear about that. So how often and for how long will students receive speech therapy or occupational therapy or ABA therapy, right? And what strategies will be implemented for evaluating the students? And then at what will be embedded in the transition plan for moving forward, okay? So remember those required components of the IEP as you start to think more about your final project. This week, we are talking about preventative strategies for classroom management. So, what is the problem when you think about classroom management? We know that learning outcomes are negatively impacted when there are a number of disruptive behaviors that are within a classroom, right? So, not only does it impact the learning for any one particular student, but overall, it has a negative impact on the learning environment for all of the students in classrooms where there's an overall sort of negative learning environment or disruptive behavior. Second, we know that ineffective classroom management also leads to teacher burnout and dissatisfaction. So, for you all as teachers, current or future, when you're not able to manage the behaviors in your classroom, it leads to teacher stress and ultimately teacher dissatisfaction and teacher burnout. And so, we have a really high attrition and turnover rate in special education teachers. And so this is one of the issues that is related to that, because if you're not able to manage the behaviors of students in your classrooms, it can have a very detrimental effect on learning outcomes and teacher outcomes in terms of retaining teachers in the field. And finally, also as it is related to you, there are teachers often receive low performance reviews when you lack classroom management skills. So when administration comes in for observations, if they're doing more informal observations as you go throughout your day, when you have those issues with managing behavior in the classroom, it is reflected on you, and it often leads to low performance reviews. So these are some of the problems that are associated with classroom management or lack thereof. Some problems that are associated with the lack of classroom management skills. So why is it more difficult to manage behavior of a group than an individual? Up until this point in the course, we've spent a lot of time sort of talking more broadly about managing problem behavior at an individual level. And so now we're thinking a bit more about how do we manage behavior at a group level, and why does that matter? So clearly there are more students than you, right? You will likely be in a setting with 1 to 3 adults and several more students. And so it's really difficult to please all of your students at once because they will have different motivations, they will have varied interests, and they will have very diverse skill levels. And so you are working to differentiate your instruction, and at the same time, you're working to provide a universally designed model of learning for students who are all at different levels, who have different interests and have different motivations. So, you really have to think about, how do I meet the needs of all my learners in one space at one time? Um, you also want to think about how people do things in the context of the group that they would never do alone. So when students come together and peers kind of engage in behaviors together, they feel like they're, more powerful in groups, right? So then there's that peer influence and peer contagion, and you have to kind of manage that on a more, um, I guess it becomes more of a bigger, for lack of a better word, problem or issue when you're working to sort of manage behavior of peers who are modeling each other or imitating the behavior of another peer, or working in groups to, they really sort of, in some cases, can fuel those maladaptive behaviors. So these are some of the reasons why behavior is more difficult to manage in a group than with one individual. So this is a little clip that I welcome you to watch, a David Spade version of classroom management. It's kind of funny. There are a couple of things in here that I definitely don't agree with in terms of, obviously the classroom management, but just generally the way he is engaging with people. But I wanted you to watch it because it is pretty funny, and it gives you an idea of, kind of, for some teachers, what those fears are in terms of going into the classroom on the first day. So he's going in as a substitute, but you can kind of think about it, especially if you are a pre-service teacher, like, how are you feeling about going into the classroom on the first day? So let's watch this, and well, you can watch it on your own time. I'm not going to watch it right now, but then think about some better strategies that you might use as you go through the rest of the lecture. So, classroom behavior management styles. There are both proactive and reactive strategies, and we'll talk a little bit more about those on the next slide. Most teachers are better at and feel better when they are embedding proactive strategies, right? So when you're proactive, you're preventing problems before they arise, and just the opposite for reactive. You are reacting to a problem after it occurs. So we focused on prevention, responding, and then intervention. And so in this module, we are focusing on preventative strategies or proactive strategies for managing behavior at a classroom level. So proactive classroom management is comprised of many preventative strategies that teachers can use to implement that teachers can implement to prevent problem behaviors from occurring. And these strategies also create a classroom environment that is conducive to learning. And so it's important to think, before problem behaviors even arise, how can I create a positive classroom space that will be an important and conducive space for students to learn, where they won't be more challenged by problem behaviors, or encouraged to engage in problem behaviors, right? So, how can we create spaces that help students learn and help teachers teach effectively? Okay. Proactive classroom management are marked by teacher behaviors and attitudes, also teacher authority and credibility, the classroom structure, and effective teaching. So these are the four major components of proactive classroom management that Michiel discussed this in this particular chapter around preventative strategies. So we'll talk through those as we go throughout the rest of this module. Reactive classroom management, again, as I mentioned, is when you kind of wait for the problem behavior to occur and then you react. Unfortunately, this doesn't promote new learning, and it probably, in most cases, sends teachers in a cycle of um, reacting after the fact. And so it's much more effective to embed proactive strategies. You can adapt them as you find necessary and then respond and intervene appropriately. So we do want to avoid reactive strategies as much as possible. So again, this week we're going to focus on Proactive classroom strategies. This is another neat little video. She kind of takes a unique stance at classroom management. So I encourage you to take a look at this and kind of keep her 10 classroom hacks, is what she calls them, classroom management hacks. Keep them in mind as we walk through the rest of the more formal or official classroom management strategies, and then think about which ones you might adopt in your own practice. So take a look at that video. And then we will move into our 16 proactive classroom management strategies. So these strategies are, they kind of overlap with all of the strategies that Michelle talks about in chapter 10. Some of them, the wording may be a little bit different, but they're all very similar. So one of the things that someone mentioned, I believe, in the feedback. I'm not sure if I mentioned this at the beginning, but having, maybe we did talk about it in terms of like the detail of the lecture. And so one of the things that I try to do with these PowerPoints is present information in a bit of a different way than is already presented in your chapter. Like sometimes it's important to like review everything that's in the chapter. Sometimes I try to highlight what's in the chapter, and oftentimes I try to embed additional materials that aren't already in the chapter because, quite frankly, you would have already read that. So I'm really trying to make this a balance between what you've read and then supplementing it with different information. So you'll find that these 16 proactive management strategies are very similar or the same as what you've already read, but they're presented in a bit of a different way. So that way you're kind of learning in through a couple different styles. So we have 16 proactive classroom management strategies that we're going to walk through. And we will start with organizing a productive classroom. So with organizing a productive classroom, all students are able to see instruction without having to strain or engage in effort, right? So in terms of the physical organization of the classroom, students are accessible or have accessibility to instruction, right? Students are not sitting in traffic areas where they can be distracted. Students should be able to walk easily without disruption. You can think about how to organize the rows with paired desks instead of tables. And there's some research that talks about the implications of paired seating and how it reduces disruptive behavior. Another strategy for organizing a productive classroom is to have problem students not be seated next to one another. So you think about how you pair your students as well. Classroom rules and procedures. I'm sure you all know by now how important it is to have clear expectations and classroom rules and procedures. It's generally best not to have more than 3 to 5 rules and expectations, because when you get beyond that, students just kind of forget like how many rules there are and what they're expected to do. But when you have 3 to 5 clear rules, when you use things like alliteration to kind of start each rule off with the same first letter, or make a song out of it, whatever it is that you will be able to kind of capture your students' attention and help them remember the rules, is very helpful. And it's also critical that you reinforce those students who are abiding by your rules and engaging in positive behaviors that support the rules and expectations of the classrooms. It's also important that you have a response cost rule. So when students are not following those classroom rules and expectations, what is the response cost for that maladaptive behavior? Another strategy here, I'm sorry, I think I skipped one. Let's go back. So we have the positive greetings. That should have been number 3 that I missed. I apologize. So that's kind of thinking about teacher style. I think, and Mitch Yell talked about this in terms of how the teacher engages. So having positive demeanor is so important. Just smile at your students and engage with them when they come into the door. It helps to set the stage for your positive classroom climate, and that is really critical. So that was strategy number 3, actually. And then we go into positive, oh, here we go. I just have the numbers off, guys. I'm sorry. So, positive greetings at the door help to establish a classroom atmosphere. You're able to kind of pre correct problem behavior. You can engage in both verbal or nonverbal interactions with students, and then you're able to pre-correct incorrect student behavior, as they come in. So really trying to set this tone and set the stage for the classroom. So you can feel free to take a break here. We are about 26 minutes in, and then when you come back, we will move forward with the rest of our strategies. So number 6 is proactive. I'm sorry, they're all proactive classroom management tactics, but this one we're thinking about managing independent seat work. And typically, independent seat work is associated with lower engagement in student achievement than teacher led activities because we're not having that additional input and engagement where you're learning in different ways and responding and reflecting on that learning. And so it's important to have clear expectations for independent seat work. For some students, particularly for younger students as they transition to more independent work, they don't quite have as much of an understanding of those expectations. So it's very important that your expectations be clear and also that you have backup assignments and activities for students who finish early. This is a big problem, particularly for gifted learners or for students who work quickly. And when they engage in independent seat work that they finish early, they often find themselves in then engaging in challenging behavior because they're finished and they're not challenged. And so they're looking for something to do, right? So make sure you have strategies for managing independent seat work. Next, you want to think about how you communicate with your students. You want to be sure to praise them. You want to be sure to provide encouraging feedback. You want to demonstrate empathy and smiling. And you want to deliver effective praise. So you want to think about the contingencies, the specificity, and the sincerity of your praise. You want to be delivering verbal praise as appropriate given particular behaviors. And unfortunately, in many cases, we have to deliver reprimands or corrective statements. So you want to be brief with those. You don't want to embed your emotions, particularly in reprimands or in punishment strategies. You really want it to be a non-threatening, soft voice. You want to think about your proximity, so making eye contact with your student. If it's a student who has severe aggression and or someone who has experienced trauma, you want to think about how close is too close, right? I think with younger kids, we're often more inclined to put a hand on the shoulder or, probably engage in a little bit more touch. But for students who have experienced trauma or for students who have, emotional behavioral disorders, you want to engage in proximity that is appropriate but not too close. So you need to gauge that based on each student. As you learn your students, get a good idea for how close is too close and how can I be responsive to their needs and let them know the expectations for the classroom without being without coming off as overbearing or aggressive, right? You don't want them to perceive your reprimand or your delivering consequences as a threat, okay? So keep those pieces in mind. Because all of those reflect communication. Your proximity to your students, the tone of your voice, the prosody of your voice, all of those things are embedded in the communicative piece. You want to teach and model behavioral expectations and pro-social skills. So thinking about school-wide positive behavior supports. You want to set aside a time to teach pro-social skills for students. You want to work on things like sharing and listening, waiting turns and turn taking, question asking. And for some of you who are working with students with more challenging communication needs, it might be a little more difficult when you're working on these pro-social skills because we're targeting them not only at a school-wide level, but also at a student level in terms of supporting their own independent or individual social and communicative needs. So you want to remember to target those strategies. You want to provide clear examples and non examples. So, what is appropriate sharing or listening, right? How do you engage in appropriate turn taking? And then you want to catch them being good. So, provide behavior specific praise when students are engaging in the right behaviors. This is one of the things that is such an easy fix that I think we do a very lousy job of in many cases, because we are always, reprimanding or acknowledging maladaptive behaviors because they do get our attention much more often, right? If a student is throwing a chair across the room, of course, that gets your attention more quickly than a student who is following all the rules and expectations. But we want to remember to catch them being good and provide reinforcement for students when they are engaging in those positive behaviors, because that all goes back to this idea of preventative or proactive behavior management, right? If you catch them being good, that encourages them to consistently, quote unquote, be good. And then hopefully you won't have to even deal with some of those more challenging behaviors in the future. Teacher proximity. So your movement and where you move your body, where you are throughout the classroom really increases student engagement. And so in order to reduce challenging behaviors, you want to teach like the floor is on fire. So in other words, you don't want to be standing in the same spot. You want to be moving around. You want to be close to this. If a student is in the back of your room and they're answering a question, you want to move a little closer to them, right? You want to not stand in the same spot for too long, because your feet are going to get burned, right? So you want to be moving around. You really want to increase that engagement. If students, especially when you start teaching those middle schoolers and high schoolers who have their cell phones, and they know, at least at the very least, when you're close to them, that they will possibly put it away, right? So just having that proximity, thinking about the impact of teacher proximity on behavior is very, very important. Okay, so teacher moving towards the responding student um, is a clear and important piece of proximity. You want to include motivation systems, so token economies or classroom-wide motivation systems. These reward systems really help to achieve desired behaviors, um, and they also allow students to have a better understanding of what is required and what the expectations are. You can allow students to receive payoff for maintaining on task behavior, and then these motivation systems also help students who are not inherently good at motivated or motivated to do specific tasks. So one of the things that I really love about motivation systems or token economies is that you can embed academic skills into them, especially for older students or students who, for example, in this picture on this slide, if you're targeting money, right? These are pretty large amounts of money. If you have some middle high schoolers who are working on, um, ways to earn money or using money. What can they buy? What can you afford with X amount of dollars? Or if you're in a vocational classroom or a functional skills classroom, you're going on a field trip, you can generalize the skills that the students have learned from their motivation system by earning fake money to a real context, right? So you can embed academic strategies or academic skills into the motivation system. We also have goal setting and performance feedback. So the goal here is to establish an ambitious behavioral goal for each student, and then to deliver the feedback to the student based on their progress towards the goal. So, oh, look, Amanda, you've done a great job working towards your goal this week. You want to acknowledge and give that verbal praise. You want to kind of catch them being good, and then provide that feedback based on their progress toward the goal. So if you have a student who is particularly working on kind of controlling his body and managing his other people's personal space, as soon as you see him following that goal or working towards that goal, you want to acknowledge that. Johnson, you are doing an excellent job this week staying within your personal space. I really appreciate how you're working on controlling your body, etc. Okay, so really deliver that feedback and then reward the individual students or the entire class for meeting that goal. So it depends on whether you're working on an individual or classroom goal, but you definitely want to always reward the students or the class for meeting those goals. Our next strategy is visual schedule posted of daily activities. I think most people agree that having a schedule is helpful for anyone with or without disabilities. And so for students, you want them to know what to expect. You want them to know when to expect which sorts of activities. You want them to know how much time will be devoted to each activity. And then they're better able to manage their behavior and time. So it's a pretty simple strategy. It really helps the students and the teachers. For students who are on the spectrum or who have issues with executive functioning, having schedules and sort of clearly delineated activities and expectations for the schedule are really, really helpful. And it's a simple way to proactively manage classroom behavior problems. Another strategy is using cueing systems to release and regain control. So the idea here is that the teacher can develop signals that release and regain attention. So you want to try at best to avoid shouting or using the light switch in the classroom. I mean, honestly, I think the light switch is something that we've been using for years that quite honestly still works. But if you can just design or work with your students to kind of come up with your own little classroom cueing system so that you're all on the same page, right? And they know that when you do this particular hand signal, it means break off into groups or independent work. And then when you're ready to regain attention, that this particular cueing system means let's come back together. So those are some of the things that administrators, when they walk into your classroom and they're like, wow, Mrs. Smith really has a great handle. Her students came right back together. They went into their groups. They came right back together. The transition was smooth. There were no challenging behaviors in between, right? So these strategies are very helpful for that. So you can use verbal or nonverbal strategies. If you can hear me, raise your hand. If you can hear my voice, raise your hand. If you can hear my voice, clap 2 times. All of those things, right? And honestly, even when I go to conferences now as an adult, some of the presenters will still use some of these strategies because they're very effective. So don't feel like you can't still use them even with middle and high school students, because it's a simple, quick, important way to regain control in the classroom, and it helps to proactively prevent behavior problems. The next strategy is having a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative interactions. When you think about supporting the needs of students with serious emotional disorders or emotional behavioral disorders, they don't want to constantly be nagged or reminded of negative experiences or challenged by punishment. So you really want to try your best to engage in positive interactions with, giving them a thumbs up or a pat on the shoulder if appropriate, or a high five. You really want to have a positive quality when students are engaging in positive behavior. So you want to help them to learn that this is a great behavior that we expect, and I'm acknowledging that you're doing a great job of that. So you want to think about how to have many more positive interactions than negative. And then when you do have to provide reprimands or corrective statements, you want to be able to do those within a context that already has this positive feeling, right? If you're in a classroom where the teacher is just constantly nagging, like, you did this wrong, go move your sticker, go move your clip, move your clip, move your clip. If that's all a student is hearing, and then all of a sudden one day they do get some positive praise, it's like, well, I mean, I guess that was nice, but 99% of the time, he's just telling me to move my clip. So, nah, it doesn't really mean much, right? But if you're in a space where the teacher is saying, excellent job, Johnson, I love the way you're following directions today. Or classroom wide, I love the way you all are following our classroom rules. Or, Jennifer, you're doing a much better job at, controlling your space. Or, I love the way you're talking to your peers in a respectful tone. And then if, every once in a while where you do have to provide that reprimand, it doesn't sting quite so much because you already have developed and created a more positive space. And so students are like, okay, well, I did kind of mess up that time. Let me get back on track so that I can get back to earning whatever it is that we are earning. Okay. So having 5 to 1 positive to negative interactions is really important. And then just smiling and being nice, right? Sometimes in the run of a day, you have IEP meetings, you have an administrator observing in your classroom, you have a parent who's coming to volunteer, you have a speech language pathologist in your classroom, you have a music therapist who stops by, you have a, adaptive PE that you go to with your students, right? Or maybe you're in a different setting and none of that is true. Either way, you have a lot going on. And sometimes we're exhausted and we just forget to smile and just to simply be nice. But you want to mirror neurons. So when one person acts, the neurons kind of mirror the behavior of another person. So simply put, if you smile, your students will smile. When you're standing at the door and you're greeting them with a smile and saying good morning, they often respond the same way. And maybe you do have that student who instead says F you, but you work on that over the course of the year, right? And you continue to smile, right? So you want them to learn how to mirror you. And so even if they are not engaging in appropriate greetings, you continue to do so that they can mirror what your behaviors are. And students learn from that modeling, right? So you're modeling that, and hopefully students will mirror that. And students will treat us how we treat them. So again, having that nice demeanor, having a smile on your face, it really cannot hurt. I promise you. So just remember that, because I think we often get so bogged down that we forget just to kind of take a breath, smile, and push forward. Okay? Another proactive strategy. And then finally, you want to provide numerous opportunities to respond. So, classrooms where teachers provide lots of opportunities are associated with more student engagement. And when students are engaged, it's hard to engage in problem behaviors, right? Like if students are answering your questions, when they are working together effectively, it's a little more challenging to be off task or to be engaging in negative behaviors. So, this goes back to the dead man's test that we talked about earlier in the semester. If a dead man can be as successful in a classroom as a live student, then there are not enough opportunities for students to respond and interact with the learning content. Excuse me. So, you want to make sure that your space is engaging enough that your students can, respond and interact effectively. And if it's something a dead man can do, then it's not engaging enough. Okay. So have numerous opportunities for students to respond and to maintain their engagement. In many cases, however, even though we do have proactive and preventative strategies, you're going to have to de escalate. And we'll talk more about this as we move into the next chapter. Next 2 chapters actually. But when you are thinking about de-escalation, you want to remember not to intimidate the student. You want to use a calm voice. You want to use fewer words. When you start using lots of language, it becomes overwhelming. You want to engage in non-threatening body posture, and you want to provide the students a way out. So there's nothing worse than like having a verbal reprimand and being punished, and then you have no idea what that even means or what to do with that, right? So you want to provide the students with a way out. So now, you know, now we're going to have an alternative activity. So not now, but later. Or why don't you take a break and get some water, and then let's reconvene and discuss our next steps, okay? So you want to provide them with a way out, but you also want to avoid shaming and ridicule, and you don't want to embarrass the student. So this goes back to that video at the beginning. You don't, it's not appropriate to embarrass our students, right? You really want to avoid that shame and ridicule. You want to create a positive space where students feel welcome, and engaged, where they're willing to be more engaged because you've created that positive atmosphere. So keep these de-escalation strategies in mind, and we'll talk more about those as we go through our next two modules. So now that we've walked through the 16 classroom management strategies, what do you think of the 10 hacks that were discussed in the video earlier in this module? Would you adopt any of those strategies that she discussed? So just take a moment to think about that and reflect on that. You don't have to submit anything, but I just kind of want you to think about, which of these strategies would I adopt? Or if you're currently in the classroom, what strategies are you using? And would you use any of those hacks? Or do you prefer to stick to our more mainstream strategies that we just discussed? And on this slide, we have some more formal classroom management strategies. So I'd like for you to kind of take a look at this. It's like a 30-minute video, so please feel free to watch as little or as much as you need to. But I do want you to watch it and just kind of identify some of the 16 strategies that we just discussed in this lecture, and see which ones he's using, how he's embedding those, and how students are responding. This is like a first day of this class, so it's pretty neat to see, how students are responding on the first day. And it's something to think about for those of you who have not yet been in the classroom. How will I go in and set that expectation, set those classroom expectations up right away so that I can proactively address challenging behaviors, okay? If you're looking for some more supports, particularly for managing behavior or classroom management in a secondary setting, I have uploaded another PowerPoint under the resources for this week. So it's called Classroom Management and Behavior Strategies for Secondary Teachers. This was a resource I found online. I did not develop it, so it's not to my credit, but it is, they do provide some good strategies for those of you who are teaching older students. That's something I try to be responsive to in this class as well, because I've always taught at elementary levels. So a lot of my examples and experiences are for younger kids. So I'm trying to do a better job of remembering to include examples for those of you who are teaching in secondary settings, okay? So that's just an extra resource that I wanted to point out. And then, as always, I often use the IRIS as a supplemental resource. So if you would like more practice with thinking about classroom management, or if you would like some additional examples or some reflection questions, feel free to use this as a resource. They have a really great classroom management module.